I now turn your attention to Patti, who will begin by reading an excerpt from her book. This will be followed by a discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm picking up on page 151. Don't mistake this for a sweet story about the intimate bond of mutual trust that would be possible for another mom and son. Moms of toddlers who scream, "No!" when they lean in for a kiss would smile at this illustration of the older boy who trusts and needs his mom to be his voice. Those moms would hope that a bond would prevail through challenging times. Moms of almost adult men will remember when their teenage sons wouldn't speak for themselves, whether stubborn or lazy, when they hear about Aaron and me and bless them. They'll remember the last vestiges of being this essential to their sons' daily lives. Illness put a filter on this scene. The way that Aaron and I tag teamed wasn't ever going to be a classic mom can't let go. We accepted that a line had been crossed, and like we were in a three-legged race, we were going to have to find a tolerance and a rhythm to move forward. Dr. Watkins took time to answer each question and spoke to Aaron, guy to guy. I hoped he wouldn't go into more details than Aaron wanted, and when he started in about how Aaron's nose was sore because the instruments put pressure on the nostrils and what the liquid from his nose actually was, I cringed. But the visual of what the heavy gauge threads coming from the back of his head were for, stitches with the tails left long, was more than even I could take. I turned away as he explained very briefly that a patient's head has to be held very still during surgery, and I silently prayed to myself that Aaron would lose interest with the surgical technique at that moment. "I'll need your help with this," Dr. Watkins said to me. "Of course." He handed me a small blue basin, the kind that people throw up in. "I think we're going to get the packing out of there for you, Aaron." While I managed my heaving guts, this meticulously dressed man used oversized plastic tweezers and pulled blood and mucus and packed, soaked with God knows what from Aaron's nostrils. Without the huge strip of gauze taped under his nose, I saw that his nostrils were swollen to the diameter of a nickel each. As Dr. Watkins pulled, the packing snaked into the basin. Once in a while, he would stop to pack it down so that another length could be pulled and laid there without spilling over into Aaron's bedding. I was almost gagging, and Aaron was gagging, tears rolling down his face, his eyes pinched shut. "Is this hurting, Aaron?" My voice quavered. I was as tense as a rolling pin and felt like I'd ripped the tweezers out of the man's hand that was hurting my kid. "No, it's just gross. Please hurry." Estimates on the length of packing vary, and I've learned that packing isn't always used post-operatively anymore, but Aaron liked asking the doctors who poked their heads into this room after the next day about how many feet there were in there. Guesses were 24 feet were common, but he could breathe through his nose now, and that made the next milestone inevitable. Aaron really wanted a shower. He'd been in a bed for 5 days, and when I suggested they offer me a large basin and a hand cloth, I'd been trained how to give a bed bath by my mother, a nurse said, "You could do that, or you could just take him down the hall to the shower." They weren't going to do it. As if to drive the stake into the disappointment and discomfort further, she added, "You're the mother, right?" I could push him in a wheelchair to the door. He'd be uncomfortable, but it wasn't far, and then he'd have to transfer to a bath chair. But if he falls, all 240 pounds of him, and I hadn't seen my son naked since he was a little boy. He was neither a man whose wife could assist him, nor a little child. "Dude, we're going to have to figure out how to do this together." And like so many things before, we got it done. I was intent on not violating his privacy and scarring our dented relationship any farther, and I didn't want to lead him to believe he would always need my help or give him the impression that he wasn't healing well or quickly enough. I had to find a way. Using handrails on the wall, he got himself seated in the shower on a supportive chair. He peeled away his hospital gown, and while I turned away, he covered himself with the towel. I stood shoeless in the small space and pointed the shower down onto him while he put his hands on my waist to support himself when he felt like he was leaning, just as the water was pouring over his hair, and he put his head back a little so the translucent stream could veil his face. I glanced down to ensure I wouldn't step on his toes. I gasped. Our feet were in an inch of bloody water. "Oh God, amen, you're bleeding." He reached a hand up to where long, wiry sutures hung from the back of his head, now obvious because his hair was flattened and wet. I looked to where the emergency call cord hung on the wall. Could I reach it without letting Aaron fall onto the tile floor? I pulled his head to me and gently picked the hair away from the scabs where the surgical pins had been. The incision points were pink. Maybe it wasn't fresh blood. I looked down again. The water at our feet was lightening in color, and as we froze there in our pose, connected yet separate, the mom and the son we were, and the two people we would be now, we let the water carry away everything that had happened this week, and we both sobbed. I washed and re-washed his hair like when he was a little boy, and perhaps because he felt the shower hid his tears, or because it was only me there, he let it all out. That was from the end of chapter 14.
Hello, Patti. Thank you so much for that reading. I know that even though I've read the book, I could feel, anyway, as the mom of sons as well. So originally we were going to do this on April the 30th, and for good reasons we've delayed it. And when we first spoke, April the 30th, the book was going to be so fresh in my mind because I just read it that weekend. And now, I mean, it's one of those things, right? So I've had the chance to kind of let it simmer and sit with me, which gives you a different impression, and I love that. So one of the things, as I was thinking about it today, is that the book offers this beautiful juxtaposition between the universal of a mother's love or a parent's love. I'm going to go with mostly mothers because we are, a lot of us are, they don't call it mama bear for nothing. Right. And then the juxtaposition of the universal versus the exceptional of this incredibly rare disorder that Aaron has and that you've had to help him navigate through. So, and in the introduction on page 20, it says, how the hell did this become my family's story? So I guess to start off is, when did you realize this was a story, that this was a book, and what was the process to drive you there?
Well, it's out of the mouths of babes yet again, so I'd like to take credit, but it was Aaron. So around the time when he was first being diagnosed, and I guess he was seeing how difficult it was for us to get the results, get the testing first and the results second, and then to find the doctors, he suggested, I guess he thought it was logical, mom being a writer, maybe we would write about this, and somehow I was so involved in the agony that I was missing the point. And he said, we really should do something about this. I think I wrote this in the preface very briefly, but he was pretty keen in the beginning on us helping other people, other kids in particular, that couldn't find doctors, that couldn't figure this out. And his impression of that changed over time. He became older and wanted his privacy, but he still thought that I should write what I'd gone through, I guess because he was watching. But we thought it would just be a blog. And that's a really common thing for rare disease folks, to write a blog. But it became a book when it couldn't not be a book, when I had experienced so much that I had to sort it out. And I think with a lot of memoirs, the sorting out happened in the first, second, and 50th draft of the book. So I didn't see it coming, is the long and short of it. About 5 years ago, I realized it was a thing, and maybe I'd finish it.
So how long did that process take you? Because I mean, I have some sense here, but I don't know if the people who are watching have a real sense of the entirety of the story, or the scope of it.
Right. So it covers 10 years, give or take, but it more or less focuses on the 18 months of really critical treatment time for Aaron. So I wrote bits and pieces about 5 years ago. I turned it into a first draft, thought I would sell it then, and realized really quickly that the story wasn't over, and realized that the story was about me. I think I still thought I was writing a medical memoir, a story about my son's rare disease 5 years ago. So I put another couple of years in it, and sometime in 2018, sold it, 2019 finished it, and here it is in the time of COVID, releasing in dribs and drabs and trickles into the world.
So obviously this is a serious memoir. I mean, Aaron's disorder, it's incredibly rare, and it has profound implications for his life and for your life. But Yet I loved how you included humor in the story, and there's many little moments. But was it an active choice as a writer to lighten your subject matter to include this humor, or is this just a way to reveal your personality, or was it actually a coping strategy that you developed along the way to deal with how many feet of packing and bloody showers and the such?
Right. It's the only way to get through. And it's also that the person I was spending most of my time with was a 16-year-old kid with a pretty, tasteless sense of humor. So, but the humor is exactly how we managed. And I suppose we were funny, but I don't think our relationship had humor at its core until we started going through this. And I found myself not being able to tell the story of what happened without telling the story of the things we said to each other. And in true writerly fashion, it was about showing how we managed, not being able to tell folks how we got through, because I still don't have the language for how we got through. It's in hindsight, you're able to minimize. And when you're in it, you just can't see it at all. I knew the lines coming out of his mouth were really poignant, but I don't think I realized how funny he was. I don't think I was laughing as much then, to be honest, Fiona, as I laugh about it now. But I let him be as irreverent as he wanted. It was like I became the teenager and he became closer to adult, and we met in the middle. And, you can't be serious in a waiting room where you're the only kid. He couldn't take it seriously, or I think it might have killed him.
Does that humor still remain in him today? Like, do you still
Oh,
have that repartee that you developed in waiting rooms?
yes, I think, and I think he says it in, sorry about the spoiler alert, in his sign off in the book. He says, people think we're so funny. It's irresistible to see the relationship that we now have, finishing each other's sentences and being funny. We appreciate each other's humor. I think it's somewhat what we hide behind sometimes too, like cellmates. You finish each other's sentences and you have all your inside jokes. Mostly it's to not have to talk about where you've gone together.
Yeah, I know that feeling. You laugh because if you don't, you'll cry.
Right.
It's true. So obviously 10 years later, how have you been changed as a parent and as a person? And have you been able to heal and move on in some ways? And I guess spoiler alert, in the book, there is a divorce right along the time of the diagnosis. So
Yep.
you were dealing with, I was sitting reading it going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And you were dealing with an awful lot. And have you healed, or where are you now?
Unhealed. I definitely used what we went through as both a reason and an excuse to not cope with everything else going on in my life. And delayed grief is grief that will revisit on you, and it revisits itself somewhat regularly. But one thing was really clear: it was not about me at the time. So whatever I needed to do to keep on keeping on for him, I did it. And that meant, don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't worry about how much you're alone. And although those things ultimately got to me, another spoiler alert, it didn't affect him, and that was what mattered to me. I think the next book is going to be using Erin's wisdom again. It's going to be the healing for me, the next part. And, the words of wisdom he slaps on me at the end of the book in what's not quite the epilogue, but close to it, where he says, it's really time to go on and live your life now. I think the living is my reward, is my healing. It's, I don't think I feel like an open wound anymore. I feel a little like a scar.
Best of us have scars, I would argue. And so one of the cute interactions again is your hairdresser, Vicky.
Yep.
And she she actually becomes a crucial connection for you, because she is in her own way. There's these moments of serendipity and coincidence where she is able to make connections and to contribute to the story in ways that you wouldn't expect necessarily from a hairdresser. So I wanted you to talk about that interesting element of coincidence and serendipity. And I think the other thing that I was, and this is maybe another question, I don't know, the other thing that I was struck about about, it was sometimes there were key people in your life who weren't pulling for you and weren't supporting you the way you really needed. And then you have people who are, casual acquaintances, but important, all of a sudden give you these moments that are going to be life-changing for both you and
That's
Aaron.
right.
And there's that contrast. So that's a lot of a big question. I'm really sorry.
Yeah,
Go with it.
Okay. So, I made a lot of the coincidences in an earlier draft, and I don't think my editor found it as fascinating as I did, but she's never been in the medical system and needed a leg up. And, you'll take the information wherever you can get it. So my favorite coincidence is that we end up at a hospital we didn't expect to be at. We end up at St. Michael's Hospital. And when I'm at Sick Kids Hospital, I say to the surgeon and the surgical team there, so you guys have never done one of these surgeries. We're in the city of Toronto, for God's sake. Somebody must have done one of these. And they name Michael Cusimano. At first, they just say the word. They say Cusimano. Well, there are a lot of Cusimano doctors in Toronto. In fact, there are at least 3 that I know of, and they're all siblings. And I said, Michael Cusimano? And they looked at me like, I was throwing around the name of friggin', I don't know, some famous person. And I said that my father had been a patient of his, and they looked at me as if I was making it up. But what I realized was that coincidence was getting Aaron his next doctor. And it wasn't the only time that happened. There was another connection through my father of another surgeon that happened to be a flying friend of my father's. And although it didn't necessarily enable Aaron's treatment, it sped it up. It got it as access, but more than anything, it gave me the nerve to step outside that comfort zone and be the mama bear. So serendipity made it possible for me to get him what he needed, because I am not the going outside of the regular channels type. I am the person that dutifully waits in line, and in fact, probably lets 18 people go ahead of her. But this was my kid. And as you see in the book, he was losing his sight really rapidly. He was growing about 1 inch every 2 months. And I knew from very frankly speaking doctors what was going to happen if I didn't get him a doctor in sort of 2 months or 4 months. So the coincidences the universe provided.
And then it was also, wasn't it Vicky that helped you with the
Yep.
diagnosis? Like she kind of gave you the heads up of what's this. She foreshadows what indeed's going to happen.
Yeah, I don't know if Vicky's on here, but she was the genius that literally made it happen. So what is the chance that your hairdresser, who clearly I need, so your hairdresser comes into your life, she happened to know the disease's name, the adult form of the disease, the top surgeon in the country, and who the doctor was I needed to get to. Now, those didn't end up being the doctors Aaron got to because they were later in life, but they were at the time the best in the disease because Vicky's mother had had acromegaly, the adult form of this disease. And Vicky, like every second in command who goes through rare disease or goes through any diagnosis with a loved one, they recognize the signs, the symptoms, the genetics. So she, not very happily, and she still to this day wishes she didn't do it, but we thank her all the time. She's family to us. She said, you know what? I think he's got acromegaly. He's got gigantism. But I knew she was talking about his facial appearance because she hadn't met him yet. But that was all it took. What I couldn't see was obvious to another person who cared enough about me to say, you know what I think? I think there's something really wrong here. So serendipity also put what I didn't want to hear into the words of someone I cared a lot about. And that made it possible for me to get my kid what he needed.
Yeah, it's that moment where you have to face what you least want to face, but at least it's got a name, so you know what you are facing.
Right. And we do want that. I mean, in the rare disease world and in the chronic and critical disease world, we do somehow feel better when we name it. And I do know many parents who have children, the diagnosis for whom they only have a gene name. But as soon as it's named, even if their child is one of 20, and there are thousands of diseases like this, literally, there's some kind of calm. There's some kind of, okay, I know who the enemy is. You've named the foe. I can beat this back. And that was it for me. But it didn't mean that gigantism was any more familiar to me than a disease that might have only had a genome name. I didn't know what I was dealing with. I knew what giants were, but I didn't know anything else.
Yeah, I think it's that words and the naming of things, there's such a power in that. And even as you said, talking to other parents, those words, that act of naming is such an incredibly powerful thing. So we just kind of went in and you talked about giants are real. And
Giants are real.
Yes. So another one of the themes that I loved in the book was that folklore and mythology are a form of truth. And I know as a teacher, it's something that when I teach myth, it's something we talk about. Giants are real. They do exist. And some of these stories that have been handed down for generation to generation, and in which often science discards, now all of a sudden there's a reason for them to listen, because there's these connections and they are there, and they've been there in our folklore and in our conversations and our stories for years, and all of a sudden it's like this epiphany moment. And so I'm wondering what you've learned about giganticism and myth, and also what are you interested in researching or exploring more?
Well, I left a lot of dangling cables. A few of my writer friends were disappointed that I didn't go deeper into it, but there simply wasn't room. But as you know from reading the book, one of the terrific discoveries, which although could have been a cornerstone pinnacle medical moment for us, the discovery of the Irish giant gene, FIPA, the AIP gene, which was discovered by Dr. Corbinitz in London, who very kindly has read pieces of the manuscript and been a second opinion from Erin for years. That led to the myth, the story, the fairy tale, the legend of the Irish giant, which was not fictitious. But there were some fictitious elements of giants that come from Ireland. Well, the fact is that medically it has now been proven that one of the hotspots for giants in the world is Northern Ireland, which certainly is where I'll say at least many decades, a few centuries back, is where the Halls come from. But that proving out that what Erin had could be genetically identified was really important for us, or so we hoped. It didn't end up explaining the disease in Erin or in our family lineage. It could, and we still suspect that Dr. Corbinitz will find the gene. She's still working on that. But what I knew of giants was I came to kind of by getting my back up. I noticed that people stared. The stigma of Erin's disease was becoming something that I found difficult to bear. And although I'm quite certain it was difficult for him to bear as well, this was something we didn't always talk about. But we spent a lot of time in public, right? Erin finished high school. Erin went on to university. Erin was commuting to downtown Toronto every day by himself, and often with me. So I noticed what people stared at. And out of curiosity, I started to investigate what I knew of giants. And I looked into the myths. I also looked into who the Irish giant had been, what the legends of the Irish giants were. And the fact was that the physical representations of giants are accurate. The diseases, symptomology is in alignment with what we were told in both myth and fairy tales, and probably in legends like of the Irish king Brian Boru. It was true. It wasn't just the height, it was other physical symptoms. And that fascination for me, that we have had this knowledge but not necessarily made the connections to science, because science has dismissed what I'll call indigenous science or ancient science that was told through story, because it was the only method of communication we had. There are a lot of diseases that are holding that. And I'm not just talking about the obvious physically stigmatizing diseases, dwarfism, gigantism, albinism, and many others. There are a lot of other hints that come from ancient folklore. So to dismiss something as not being true because it's old, or because it became a story that was told to children, I hope I can go into the work around that. And that certainly is the next book that I have planned to go into: giants, medical, mythical, and magical.
I'd like to give another plug. There's a book out called by Amanda Leduc, and it also looks at the whole idea of ability or disability and fairy tales, and how these things interconnect, where we build these moral structures around how people look and assumptions about how they act, and it's when you start to really look at it, it's not as simple as, well, he's tall, or she's, got a club foot, or there's whole
so much more to it. Mhm.
And it impacts sociology and psychology and everything. It's
And it goes into how we interact, doesn't it? I mean,
Mhm.
stepping into this space of stigma wasn't anything I would have predicted 10 years ago, but it was a natural fit for me because my kid gets pointed at, stared at, ogled. People asked to take his picture in public. You know, it's he's treated quite like he's an act in a circus a lot of the time. So it wasn't something I was going to be able to leave alone as a writer or as a mother or as a person, because I'm confronted with it all the time with him. And I do wonder how he absorbs it, but it isn't just Aaron's disease, and it isn't just his diagnosis. Those 300 kids who have it in the world right now, it's not just about them. It's about everyone that gets tagged with any diagnosis or any label. And that's the place I want to go next.
I would be very interested in reading that, because and yes, you've certainly hit a nerve for me. I just, Anne just texted me, and one of the comments is, she said, there are a lot of people here putting in the chat line that they're very proud and very happy to be here with you tonight. And I thought I wanted to share that. So thank you, everybody who are contributing to the chat line and to the questions. We really appreciate it. And I promise we are going to get to stuff, because I've only got a couple more questions left. So much of the memoir is a detailed and not always flattering look at healthcare, and with Aaron's and your experiences in the system. In Canada, we like to think our universal healthcare is there for everyone, but for those of us with rare and orphan diseases, that is not always the case. We are kind of we've kind of become second-class citizens, quite frankly. So can you speak to what you have learned regarding this, and what advice you would give a parent or patient now? And then I guess my follow-up question is, obviously you're passionate. You have learned how to advocate. You said, you were the person who would let 18 people go ahead of you.
Oh, yeah.
I get a sense you might not be that person still. And so I'm wondering, have you learned to take these wonderful advocacy skills and apply them to other issues or passions? Again, I do two questions at once. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, way to go. This is a nice test, Fiona. I was pretty factual in the book, in dealing with the people that disappointed me, in dealing with my own shortcomings, in my own self-criticism. I probably got a little long-winded, but, we were very disappointed by certain medical experiences. But I have to tell you, we couldn't have achieved for him what we did if we lived almost anywhere else. But I will tell you that geography was the greatest of coincidences. Being in central Canada, being in this kind of proximity to Toronto, being in the proximity of the two named Canadian experts that had literally were the names that people kept giving to me, that made all the difference. Universal healthcare made this affordable for us, but we didn't know it was going to turn out that way. We already knew we were going to pull at all the stops to get this kid what he needed. And the book opens, or shortly after the hook in the opening, I'm on the phone with a doctor in California saying to myself, I haven't even talked to my husband, but what do we have to do? Are you the only people that can save my kid? So we had tremendously wonderful experiences once I got through the wall of being heard, being seen, and Aaron got through the being diagnosed. So geography wasn't the only coincidence that facilitated the health outcomes that we achieved. The other part was he has a very notorious, infamous disease. So that piece will forever be something I'd like to speak to, is the diseases that aren't facilitated for those who are diagnosed, that aren't treated in the same way that Aaron's was, because Aaron's was so recognizable. I mean, he walked into a doctor's office and his favorite doctor knew on site what he had. That doesn't happen very often. So our outcomes were facilitated by that. But don't get me wrong, I knew exactly how difficult it was for every other mother and child in waiting rooms. We were consciously aware that it could be so much worse for us. And when we said it could be so much worse, that's what we meant, is maybe we wouldn't have a diagnosis. Maybe we wouldn't have this awesome surgeon who I got too fast because I said my dad had been one of his patients. What if I didn't have that? And here's the answer. You wait a hell of a long time. And I do believe, however, that our healthcare system takes care of the most critically ill as expeditiously as possible. Aaron wasn't critically ill in an obvious way, but I felt like it was critical to his quality of life, and it was. He was outgrowing his body, he was losing his sight, you know, that kind of rapid growth. We knew that he would grow to 7'4" if we didn't hurry, and I could do the math at how many months it would take for him to grow to 7'4", and I needed to get there first. So if these coincidences, if the fortuitousness of the universe hadn't made things possible, we would have been years. We would have been years. And I'll say that folks with the adult form of this disease, because I can't speak to others very eloquently or expertly, folks with acromegaly sometimes go 10 to 15 years without diagnosis and treatment because the symptoms don't declare themselves as evidently as my child, who was growing an inch every 2 months. It was starting to declare itself. You know, he couldn't walk and he was losing his vision and his face was very distorted, etc. If that hadn't been true, we would be like everyone else, waiting 5-10 years to get it figured out.
And so along with that, I don't, and I have to say, I can't reference the book specifically, but you talk about taking extensive notes and documenting things. Is that, do you think for people who are doing advocacy work with rare and orphan diseases, is that kind of just meticulous note taking is, I mean, obviously you then use them as a writer, but
Yeah.
for those who might not be, you know, inclined to write the story later, are those kind of strategies key, do you think, to the whole process?
Absolutely. You know, it was 10 years ago when I was actively learning how to advocate, and I wasn't running around with a smartphone, right? I wasn't running around able to take pictures of his test results or his, you know, his tubes. I wasn't able to, you know, take a picture of going into a CT scan. I wasn't even able to take a picture of more than our parking lot number. So the notes, I used every piece of tech I could at the time, but I'll tell you what's even more important than the notes is the awareness and the ability to calmly and rationally say, what if that's not true? And could you just hear me out on such and such? You know, the awareness that as the advocate, as the parent, as the second in command, I like to call it the sidekick, just know that the things that you see are valid. And that's what I say all the time to those going into the medical system, is that my awareness of Aaron, I had a PhD in that kid. And although I don't have the aggro to sort of say, listen, buddy, you better pay attention to me, I did have the ability to say, hey, can you take a second look at this? Or what about this? You know, and then I've since then said, like, what about his brother? And even with my own health, I've gone into testing because we've wondered if symptoms coming up with me could be related to something that he has. So sell yourself as an advocate by being the person who holds the information in the notes, but also that awareness of being able to say, no, that's not normal. He's not been acting the same way the last 3 days as he was 3 weeks ago. And know that if anything could be improved in the compassion in the medical industry, it would be the listening to advocates.
I think that's it. And it also, sorry, and it also goes back to the folklore and the giants, right? It's that other ways of knowing, the value of other ways of knowing. And it's you as a mom, you as an advocate, folklore, like there are all kinds of ways to access important information, and medical school and data, although very valid, are not the only ways to access information that can allow us to grow and to understand.
I think you remember the scene where Aaron and I go into a darkened room. You know, we're waiting in yet another waiting room. We go into a darkened room, and I can't remember the count now, but I got it right in the book. There were like 16 white coats in this room. And up on the screen is this gigantic picture of the inside of my son's head. And there's 2 little chairs. You know, my son doesn't fit in a little chair. There's 2 little chairs, and he and I squeeze into this little spot, and we're surrounded by doctors who talk to me. They talk to me. So the irony was, you know, he was too big for a bed in a children's hospital, and people mistook us for being a married couple, me being like his girlfriend or wife because he's so tall. If they didn't see his baby face, he has a baby face because of his disease, not because of his age. And that was another mistake that was made so often. But there we were in this room, and they were asking me, how does Aaron feel? And, you know, those alienating experiences were plentiful. And those are the ones he can't forget. Those are the ones that he clings to, and probably why he doesn't love going into the hospital system quarterly, which he still does every 3 months. He'll be checked and MRI'd for the rest of his life.
That must be incredibly difficult for him. So the question I alluded to earlier was that have you continued to be an advocate for other issues and found other passions moving forward?
You know what? I think I've got a no to that so far.
Okay.
Although I am
That surprises me, actually.
I'm just now getting active with, although I have been a supporter of many other people's medical journeys. I'll be fair there. Medical has always been my thing. I've just now gotten active with the newly expanded Acromegaly Canada. Which has been expanded. It's an advocacy organization, obviously, for acromegaly and gigantism, so that has started. Erin and I were involved in a few things with St. Michael's Hospital, but you can't advocate for a disease that almost no one else has, apparently, because you can't get funded, you can't get listened to. Who are you going to talk to? How would I find people? And that is something I knew had to be the right time. And the real reason at the base of it is that I didn't want to go into advocating around Aaron's disease if he wasn't comfortable doing it himself. And I didn't feel like that was about me. But now I see that as the caregiver, I'd love to go into the caregiver space and support around that, because that's a place I know from this book and others that I've written.
It's interesting, and especially as you alluded to about all the technology and how that would change your note-taking and detail-taking now. It has also changed the advocacy role, because it has allowed it to actually, for these rare and orphan diseases, you can actually get a global vision now,
right.
Which is very different than, when you started this journey 10 plus years ago.
Right.
So one of the things that I note as I read the epilogue and the acknowledgements at the end was how tight a circle the three of you had become. And Aaron's brother, Justin, is part of the story too. By the way, we haven't talked about him, but he's very much there. So my question was, I sat there and thought, oh my gosh, what if, who's the poor person who's going to become the significant other in this family?
Right.
Oh my gosh, what kind of person do you think they would have to date in order to, to be accepted? Yeah. And finally, of course, how is Aaron now?
Oh, that's great. I love that question. Well, he's big, he's tall, he's got a personality that suits his disease. He's literally living large. He's great. I'm answering the second question first. He finished university, got what we call in the book his big boy job, and loves his vehicle and his job and animals. And he's exactly who he was in the book still, but older. He is medically as healthy as he can be. He will continue to have quarterly checkups. Again, spoiler alert, but at the end of the book, we get the first of what we consider good news. And for us, that was him not having to come back to see the brain surgeon as frequently, because to him, it was the radiation treatment that was the worst of all. So to go to that hospital, he sees that as success if he doesn't have to go back to the hospital where his radiation treatment was given. So that's it for him. So who's it going to take? Well, she better be funny, let me tell you. And, I think it's a classic, Fiona. Like, I think she better be a little bit like me, but a lot like them. We're all really introverted. We're all, we have a really sick sense of humor. If you're not family, it's pretty hard to figure out what we're snickering about and put up with us. But, we're like our own baseball team, Justin and Aaron and I. It is nonstop giggles. And it takes somebody who can hold space for where we've been, but not be able to be part of it. And that's not an easy function, but I think we'll make our way somehow.
So Anne has been texting me
Has she?
the chat questions, right?
I can't see the chat. This is so exciting.
So one of the questions is, will you ever write fiction?
Well, I wrote some fiction, whoever the clever person is asking that. I will go back to finish some fiction that I started. So believe it or not, the first 2 novels I wrote were young adult, and the main character's name was Aaron. And it was before Aaron was born. I would go back to fiction that is either based in history or based in medicine. It would have to have this conviction I have for Indigenous science and storytelling, and it would have to have that. So possibility. but it's going to have something sciencey or medical or something that hinges it for me. If I'm going to step into fiction, I think I'd have to slip over there and not quite make the leap. I'm kind of too afraid.
So, big reveal. Jamie Fraser has been one of my boyfriends for years, and I
he's
don't
your
care what
boyfriend
anybody
too.
else says. I have known him for about 20 some odd years, so he's mine. But so, in keeping with that, if you were, you said historical fiction, which is one of my personal loves.
Me too.
What time and place? Where would you go?
Well, World War II is my obsession. I read everything that was written with fiction, World War II. I think if I would go back to the time of the Celts in Ireland, if I had, or actually wherever the Celts were, because it wasn't just Ireland, I'd go back to the time of the Celts. Celtic women. I'd go back to Celtic women if I had my other option.
Yeah, Boadicea and that whole, that's some great stories there.
Alchemy, right?
Yeah. Do you have, so if flipping, another question comes, how do you deal as a memoir writer who is writing about something traumatic and obviously very upsetting? How do you deal with documenting that accurately and adding enough emotion to engage your reader, but at the same time, not so much emotion that you're re-traumatizing and reliving for you?
Beautiful question. There's a secret to writing about trauma, and that's to allow enough time between the cutting and the scabbing over. And I didn't realize when it was. And I know that one writer that worked with me for a long time, I can see that Carly Verheyen is on here, and this will ring a bell for her, that when I wrote my book the first time, I was writing about the wound, but I hadn't been able to synthesize how we'd done since and what we'd become, and that we were okay for certain reasons. So how do you do it? You minimize the trauma in its actuality, but you go long on reflecting on its impact. And I think that's how it's relatable for people, because, I'm pretty intentional when I say this isn't just my story. This was, first of all, Erin's trauma that I burdened myself with and would do again because love. But this could be anybody's story, any disease. I could be any caregiver. It's your story, Fiona. It's the story of every single person that sends me an email that says, holy shit, that's exactly what it felt like. And the podcast interviews that I'm doing now, they're releasing sort of a couple a week right now. It all goes into that they can see places that I went because they went there too.
So again, I got another note about how proud people are of you.
So make sure you tell me later. Somebody's proud of me. I think it's more
than
my
one.
Sister. It's my sister. It's all my sister.
You have 7 of them then. So one of the questions is, how can people spread the word about your book? How can we help you? Buy a book, please. People, buy a book.
Yeah, buy a book. Go to every little bookstore and ask them to order it in, because I want the bookstores to be supported too. Spread the word, get me to go talk about it somewhere, because I can, and it doesn't hurt anymore. And because Erin's given me more than permission, and I'm ready to talk about what it's like to go to the dark place and not be ashamed of it anymore. Spread the word about that. I will be interviewed just about anywhere now. I will not be doing that later. So I say, hit me while you can, Fiona.
Okay. So what have I mean, you know some of my backstory, but one of the things I often say to one of my Janes is I say, so in Lorenzo's Oil, when they make the movie of Lorenzo's Oil, and who are you going to get to play the Susan Sarandon character? Because that's my friend Jane in the rare disease world I live in. So then the question becomes, the movie writes, who do you cast to play Erin?
Cast to play Erin. Okay, so first, get everybody on the chat talking about who we should cast to play me, and don't say Reese. No Reese Witherspoon. There's no Reese Witherspoon.
She's getting too much coverage these days, anyway.
Right? I think I'm Sandra. Oh, you know who I mean. Anyway, yes. Okay, we'll dye her hair. Hair.
Okay. Yeah.
Who would we get to play Erin? Oh, you know what? Can I put a pin in that? Because
you can, absolutely.
I don't think anyone's got the talent. So first of all, no one has the size.
Yeah.
But no one's got the scope. He's larger than life. And when he was really ill, we used to say that he was magic. And we, in fact, created a line of t-shirts that we didn't do anything with, but it was one of the things that we did. And people would always say to him, how'd you get so tall? And finally, one of his responses was, I'm magic. And I've always kind of chosen to believe he might be a little bit supernatural. So maybe they can't get anybody to play him at all. However, the movie rights are up for sale, so I'll keep you posted.
Oh, okay. That sounds, I'll see if I can start see if send you good vibes. So one of the other questions, and we're jumping around just because that's the nature of questions, of course,
yes.
is
and tell me who's going to play me. If anybody says who's going to play me, let me know.
Well, there we go. The question's out there, folks. If you have an actor that you would recommend for Patti's role, please, we'd love to see. And it said, what do you, when in those moments of despair, when you felt the entire weight of the world on your shoulders, where did you go to find the hope, or where did you go to, to find a foundation?
You know what? I had to listen to the people that loved me in spite of myself, and they're all named in the book. I relied on people to love me more than I loved myself. And there weren't many because I wouldn't let them be there. Faith didn't do it because I was angry, and faith wasn't enough, and faith wouldn't have been enough. I was angry at that time and I blamed everyone. I was deeply alone by choice, but the people that wouldn't take no for an answer said I'd get through it, said I was the strongest person they knew. But more than that, they fed me. They got me up out of bed and told me how long it had been since I showered. But here's the bottom line. Those 2 kids got me through everything, because I couldn't stay in bed. I didn't want them to see. I couldn't go down hard because I still had to raise them with their dad. I still had to do my share, I still had to get them to school, and I wanted Justin to have a normal life, and I wanted Aaron to have the quality of life that we'd worked so hard to get for him. So going down permanently wasn't an option. So they're the answer. They're how I did it.
I totally get that. So we do have a vote for Laura Dern or Toni Collette. I
Laura
like the Laura Dern.
I like it. Thanks, guys, for that.
That's a good one.
Oops.
So back to the dating, and I had said, I talked about, what kind of person could Aaron or Justin bring home? And so that this person has flipped the question, and they said, how has it affected your experience dating with a potential partner, in that, you have this whole backstory. How much do you share? And obviously it's informed the person you are now today. So how do you juggle that in dating for you? And you can pass on that if you've decided it's too personal, by the way.
No, I mean, in this book, is there anything too personal? Although I'll tell you that I did cut the relationship pieces out of this book, but I won't cut them out of the next one. I plan on taking all the dangling cables from this one and posing questions like that to myself in the memoir that will come next. I'd like to call it Where To Next, because that's what Aaron basically challenges me with at the end of Loving Large. You know what? I'd be blind to say it hasn't affected things. I haven't allowed myself to go into a place in a relationship that they weren't comfortable with, or that, and I never gave them the right to comment, but I can sense whether things are a fit or not. It's a lot like that question of you asking me what kind of person would come into our circle of 3. It's as true for me bringing someone in as it is for them. And the fact is that I have a lot of resistance to changing the way that the 3 of us are, even though time is changing us. I'm not doing that well with the change. I've got a lot of work to do on that. Did I skirt the edge of that enough?
No, you know what? As you were talking, I mean, number one, as I'm trying to catch my phone as things are being texted to me. So we've also got Julianne Moore and Uma Thurman.
Julianne Moore, thank you.
So you're getting some great suggestions. I like this. For me, as me, the moderator, well, not the moderator, me as Fiona, I have to say I love the way the dogs are part of your story. And to
know me is to know how true that is, or to follow me online. And I'll tell you, the most difficult pieces to write were the pieces with the dogs, because we can't hide from that agony. Losing them, having to give Reef up, and then to get Reef back, and then ultimately to lose Reef knowing what he's been to Aaron, but to have to do right by these animals. And they're also one of the big ways that the boys and I connect. You know, that's one of the secrets, is we're all passionate animal lovers. And so, you know, Aaron's 26. He and I don't chit chat every day. We do, however, send each other puppy pictures.
And I think when we talked about what were your coping strategies, one of the people who didn't get enough credit was the four pod people in your life.
I know. I wondered why I didn't do that. I wondered why I didn't name all the pets, but you know, I can fix that still.
For me, it made me feel closer to you as a person, because you know, as it was one of the books that I read. I think it's Lockhart. Anyway, it's called When We Were Liars, and in the course of the book, you find out that the dogs die, and there, you know, there are people who die in this book. And there's a horrible tragedy in this book. And I'm like, but you killed the dogs. And I'm just not sure I can forgive you for that.
Yeah, I didn't want it to happen either. But, you know, there's a joke in my coaching practice that if anyone wants to work on a book with me, there's one rule: no harmed, no sick, no dying dogs. And of course, I write a book where my dog dies. So I'm a hypocrite.
No, but that was, I mean, Reef still gets to live his life. I don't remember he or she. They still get to live their life with you, and they get a whole entire loved life as a dog. So I don't think you should punish yourself for that, because he was loved and he was celebrated and he was honored. So I think like, really, what else could a pet ever want?
That's true. He was adored.
You should definitely give yourself a get out of jail free card on that one.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm going to do that. You know, it was one of the things we took for granted, was how much the everydayness, the waking up, the imperative of caring for the animals was one of the reasons I got up. And I had a lot of animals through the early years of Aaron's illness, but it connected us, but it also gave us a reason to get out of our heads. And that's how Aaron and I did it. I mean, training those Goldens when they were young was how we got out of our own heads, for sure.
And I love that part of your story. So thank you so much
for
sharing. So we're at our end, I think, and all these wonderful suggestions. So, you know, when you sell the movie rights, you can tell them. So these are the people I'd like you to talk to.
Right, Tony Collette, goods, that's good.
And of course, I'd like to give a quick plug for all independent bookstores.
Yes,
Buy
please.
your book. Please, an independent bookstore would be the best. And I think moving forward from this whole pandemic, the arts, the writing and the arts, these are what keep us in touch with our humanity. And things should be, you know, these are things that we should very much value moving forward. And so I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd like to thank you for writing your story and for sharing with us, and just thank you. Thank you,
Fiona. It's a complete pleasure. Thank you so much.
And to thank you to everybody else for showing up. And Tali, I believe it's back to you.
I can see everyone now.
Woohoo! And there's Tali back. Yay!
Hi, Tali.
Hello. So on behalf of all of us here tonight, I'd like to thank Patti and Fiona. Thank you to each of our guests for attending this evening's event. We are so happy that you could join us. Patti M. Hall's memoir, Loving Large, can be purchased online at Indigo, Amazon, and of course at all of your local independent bookstores. For more information about the Soapbox Press, you can visit us at thesoapboxpress.com. And for more information about the Authors Book Club, you can visit theauthorsbookclub.ca. Have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you again very soon.